Okay, now we jump into talking about the Frankfurt School. One kind of shortened way of thinking about the Frankfurt School is basically these were the group of intellectuals in the 1930s that came up with this concept of mass society or mass culture. Maybe sometimes what we mean when we say something like mainstream culture, like I'm against mainstream culture, or that's so mainstream culture. In the background, intellectually, are these guys who are writing, and they were all guys, I apologize for that, we're all writing about a particular view of culture that emphasize kind of the mass industries that have kind of created this big, huge thing that that people often talk about when they mean culture. Things like movies, radios, television shows, that sort of thing. The Frankfurt School are our good friends Adorno and Horkheimer, a reading of which we had for this week, a classic reading, a difficult reading I should say, partly because of the time, but partly because they were also intellectuals. So they weren't just kind of what you may have bumped into a lot in sociology classes, which is kind of sociologists that have a data set, a method, a question, and then some conclusions. These were intellectuals in a broad sense of trying to make sense of these massive changes that were happening in terms of politics, military, economics by the 1930s, and trying to get a sense of what that meant for the society around him. Adorno and Horkheimer escaped Germany. They had been in Frankfurt, hence the name Frankfurt School, into the early 1930s, really from 1920 to early 1930s. And by the time they escaped Germany, or the reason they escaped Germany, is really the rise to power of Hitler and the Nazi Party by the 1930s. And basically, my sense is the reading on the wall that they realized that this was a society that was beginning to destroy itself and making enemies out of people who lived on the same street. By the end of World War II, actually by the beginning of World War II, they were also familiar with Joseph Goebbels. Now, if you know anything about the Nazis or 20th century international history, you know that Joseph Goebbels was basically the inventor of modern-day propaganda. Goebbels was nothing short of brilliant in his ability to appropriate new mass media technology, radio broadcasts, movies, this sort of stuff, posters, all those sorts of things that get propaganda out, and to marry those with basically an ability to get information and to tell a story. A good way of thinking about what Goebbels did, how he aided the rise of the Nazis, was to get information, political information, in the minds of the people through entertainment. So basically, to accomplish a political mission through what was only understood before as being done through, to accomplish a political mission through entertainment. So no longer to have those divided. Over here you have political debates and political parties, and over here you have fun entertainment, but to actually marry those together, and so therefore in some ways to get the pill of fascism spread through surrounding it in the peanut butter or the sugar of entertainment. Think of how you sometimes have to give pills to your dogs, and it's often that way. You got to put the hard stuff that no one would want to deal with in the middle and then sugarcoat it. A terrific film about Joseph Goebbels, if you're interested in all, is called The Goebbels Experiment in 2005. A really wonderful film. You can get it on Netflix about him personally, but then also his propaganda work for the Nazis. So Adorno and Horkheimer escape the Nazis, and they're writing. Adorno actually settles here in Santa Monica, here. I was actually on the Santa Monica beach for Labor Day, a wonderful place to be, and sits and writes this famous essay, a part of which we read for this week. And what they were kind of reacting to was what they saw as basically the decline and collapse of the Enlightenment. So if we remember the Enlightenment from our history classes, 1600s Europe, what we often call the Age of Reason. And the Enlightenment is this kind of high point for intellectuals to think about the pursuit of truth, math, science, literature, through the use of reason. And it was this idea that the human mind had no limits and could freely explore truths that could be found as long as the human mind was allowed to do that, as long as the human mind was not coerced. And at this, one of the political movements that comes out of the Enlightenment is this growing idea of the specialness of humanity as thinking beings, and this, if we were to actually take that specialness seriously, then that has political consequences. In other words, Enlightenment helped pave the way for democracy, for equality of participation, for the voice of all individuals. And slowly, over the course of Western history, we see the impact of that whole intellectual trend from the Enlightenment. And Adorno and Horkheimer are looking around at them and saying, holy crap, the Enlightenment has completely fallen apart. What we see around us in our mass society today is actually, in some ways, the antithesis of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment has collapsed. So what were they talking about? Well, they felt like mass society had become completely bureaucratized. So governments, corporations, all aspects of life had become really kind of under the spell of these major bureaucracies of people that brought about uniformity, brought about narrow vision, so you just do your one thing in the cog in the machine, and had brought about passivity amongst people, no longer kind of exploring the reality of humanity and the reality of the world, but just kind of narrowly focused in on the task in front of them. And they called this thing mass society or mass culture, this kind of nasty, homogeneous blob that had occurred in humanity because of basically the successes of the 1800s and bringing industry and bureaucracy into all aspects of human life. And so what he saw was that the culture industry, TVs, movies, radio, are basically catering to this mass blob and creating this mass blob by appealing to the lowest common denominator. So great examples of this, you don't have to go far, are most kind of Hollywood summer releases that it's like, oh, it's either action by which, surprise, surprise, the hero always wins, or a romantic movie which, surprise, surprise, the hero and the heroine always end up in love together. And so they had this sense that the culture industry, instead of showing the complexity of humanity and reality, was instead bringing all of us down to the lowest common denominator as a way to kind of keep this mass public, this mass society connected, and therefore influenceable or able to be influenced by the people who produce culture. They pointed out, and they pointed out pretty strongly in the essay, that the culture industry, the people that make movies and television and radio and magazines want one thing and one thing only, which is to turn a profit. So they were very clear about this, that it was the profit motive, that these corporations were not about making communities more equitable. They were not about helping people to understand the real issues of their society. They were not about trying to get more people to participate in self-government through democracy. They weren't about that. They fundamentally were about turning a profit. And to turn a profit, they used that lowest common denominator approach of pumping out stuff that everyone could kind of respond to. And Adorno and Horkheimer assumed that what had happened to us, the audience, is that we had become kind of passive, that we had reached a point where we were trying to kind of escape from the deadening boredom and uniformity of society by kind of escaping into what they pointed out was the deadening boredom and uniformity of the culture industry, though their claim was that audiences really didn't understand that. They had so been kind of deadened to the possibility of humanity and a good society that they were now kind of trapped and just kind of fed these sugar candies of the culture industry one day after another. Now, interesting is you should note some ties with Gramsci's concept of hegemony. So, if you remember correctly, Gramsci had this sense that these common sense beliefs are spread throughout all of society, and they kind of make sense of the world that we live in, but they make sense of it through the lens of a capitalist era. And Adorno and Horkheimer are saying a similar thing, which is it's not necessarily common sense beliefs, but it's the actual culture industries themselves that pump out this culture that we consume. Back in their time, we consume maybe on a weekly basis, but now you and I consume instantaneously through Twitter and the internet and things like that. And so they're looking, or they're making somewhat like a Gramsci argument and saying there's something. Gramsci was hegemony, Adorno and Horkheimer, it was the culture industry that ties this mass together and kind of keeps this mass of people in the middle from really being aware of the actual conditions of the world. They noted that cultural movies and TV shows and stuff were generally kind of bland, and that companies would usually make similar products. So the actual culture industries themselves weren't really that creative, according to Adorno and Horkheimer. And I don't know, maybe if you were to look at, say, all the vampire books, movies, and television shows of the last 3 or 4 years, you might see where they had a case and where their prescription or their description of what the culture industry was about could even still stand today. There was a sense in which they had, as you can see in the articles, some very strong things to say about what this meant for the nature of modern society. Now remember, they had lived through the rise of the Nazi regime. They had seen what World War II had done to the world. So they, in some ways, had kind of clear eyes about the worst case scenario for what this sort of mass culture industry could do. But they also had other kind of scenarios, and particularly Adorno, sitting here in Santa Monica, a beautiful spot in the United States of America, I think had some conception in that essay of what could happen to the United States being held in the grip of this culture industry. Let me finish this segment here on the Frankfurt School by mentioning a clip that I'm going to put the link to on the D2L website. Many of you have probably watched the movie Devil Wears Prada. I'm going to clip to about a famous 2-minute segment within the Devil Wears Prada, where you can see very clearly Adorno and Horkheimer's argument that there is a system of cultural production, in this case fashion, that there are decisions made by central decision makers in that system, and that the perception of the people in the culture industry system is that they're doing this on behalf of a public that will consume whatever is put out to them and will have no knowledge of the process that got to the point of consumption. So in this clip, we have Meryl Streep talking famously about a cerulean sweater. Cerulean is, I guess, a shade of blue, and talking about how serious for her as a participant in the culture industry the production of that sweater is. But you can see as you watch it Adorno and Horkheimer's argument about these industries and about how influential they are and about how much of it is driving to basically keep pumping stuff out for consumers. So I will post that link to the website. I suggest you watch it right now before you watch the last part of this lecture, which I will be getting back to in just a moment.